We are now in what's known as a sixth mass extinction. The rate of species loss is higher than it's been for literally thousands of years.
50% of the global economy is dependent on nature or the services it provides. So that 1% of GDP investment looks very, very cheap to protect that 50% of the global economy.
We need leaders to commit to maintaining biodiversity and to making it central to the way we live our lives.
I would never say we're spending too much money on pandas or any other species. Globally, we're actually underspending significantly on biodiversity conservation.
Developing countries are in part losing their biodiversity because of developed countries. If we always put the responsibility on the countries with biodiversity, then we've lost.
And despite countries having differences on different political issues, this is an area where we have a shared interest. So it's really important that countries work together.
I'm Miao, and this is China Chat. In this episode, we spoke to our British experts about the upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming and discussed how we can all do our part to prevent biodiversity loss around the world for future generations. Both of you will be in Kunming for COP15. And the summit's theme is actually Ecological Civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. So Alice, could you explain the concept of Ecological Civilization, which is originally Chinese?
So it's not easy entirely to translate the concept, but basically living in harmony with nature is the very definition of sustainability. And in international dialogues, I often hear pushback from people saying, oh, it's a Chinese concept. But actually what it basically means is living sustainably, not taking more than we need and not taking more than can be replenished. It should be a global consensus.
So ecological civilization to me is about having a holistic view of the economy and the environment as interconnected. And we've talked about the value or how much our economy depends on nature. We're starting to understand that much better now. And I think all of these studies and this research is telling us that we need to manage our natural capital in the same way that we manage our built capital and human capital. So we need to invest in it and value it much better as we move forward over the next 10 years.
Why do you think the United Nations is promoting this concept globally?
Because it's essential. I mean, we are now in what's known as a sixth mass extinction. The rate of species loss is higher than it's been for literally thousands of years, and that's because of how we are affecting the planet. If we're going to reverse that, we need a fundamental shift in how we live. And that means acknowledging the fact that biodiversity is our life support machine. That means that we need to maintain it.
But according to the United Nations, the world has largely failed to meet the targets set in 2010 to safeguard species and ecosystems. Is it because the targets were too ambitious, or was there not enough work done to accomplish those goals?
I think the two main reasons why we're actually experiencing accelerating biodiversity loss are that, first of all, the process involves and is led by environment ministers who are generally relatively weak in governments. So they don't have much power they don't control the resources, they don't control agriculture, they don't control energy, many of these areas that are so important if you need to tackle biodiversity loss. And I think a lesson from the climate change UN process was that when leaders started to get involved, and economic ministers and finance ministers, that was when progress began to be made. And that process really started at Copenhagen in 2009, which led up to the Paris Agreement. And I think biodiversity needs to learn from that process and involve leaders and finance ministers and economic ministers. I think the second reason is a lack of resources attached to the biodiversity agreement. So I mentioned earlier that we looked at how much was being spent on biodiversity and nature protection globally and how much is needed over the next 10 years, and there's a big gap, $700 billion per year over the next 10 years. So we need to be very clear have very clear mechanisms for generating that funding to go into biodiversity conservation. And so resource mobilization is a really important aspect of the new framework. So that's something that I really want to see focus on in the Kunming meeting, because without that resource going into biodiversity conservation, I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve the targets that may be set in Kunming.
Alice, how about you? What would you like to see in Kunming?
So I think having a dialogue that makes us better value biodiversity, but also allows us to develop a set of targets that are meaningful and that are achievable, as well as something that has incremental steps to help us get there, is fundamentally important. And I don't know that we are there yet. The biodiversity COPs are tiny. The resources allotted to biodiversity are tiny, and sustainability has become conflated with climate change. They're not the same. We need to remember that biodiversity is fundamental, and we need to provide the finance and the financial mechanisms to make sure that it is there into the future. And those dialogues are still only things that are happening on the fringes. And as Terry said, we need governments, we need leaders to commit to maintaining biodiversity and to making it central to the way we live our lives. But part of that, and something that has been missed in former frameworks, the majority of the world's biodiversity is in developing countries, which have limited resources and are economically developing, and of course they want a better quality of life for their people. If we always put the responsibility on the countries with biodiversity, then we've lost. We need to facilitate sustainable development, and that means providing the funding to enable these countries to maintain their biodiversity. This is why developed countries, which are often the importers of products that rely on biodiversity and drive biodiversity loss, need to be responsible. And if the targets do not take that into account and provide the financial mechanisms that enable it, then the targets will be theoretical, because we can't expect countries like Indonesia and Cambodia to have the resources to say, okay, well, we're not going to let these areas develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, some of these rainforests, for example, provide huge services for the whole world, clean air and climate contributions, and so rich countries that benefit from that have to pay for that service. So the countries that have the stewardship of those ecosystems that are providing services for the whole world, they should be helped.
A lot of it comes down to that. The reality is that developing countries are in part losing their biodiversity because of developed countries. We live in an interconnected world, and unless we realize that, unless we put this into the framework, then we've lost.
So apart from getting more resources in the future, many scientists would agree that protecting umbrella species is the optimal choice humans can make with limited resources. I guess you guys would agree on that one, or not?
Kind of.
If we're taking panda as an example, so how do you think this panda conservation is working well?
I think, like most things, it's more complicated. So pandas are fantastic at being ambassadors for biodiversity and protecting things like temperate forest. But what if, say, I'm studying a bat or a limestone karst lizard? Now, a karst, for most of the audience who probably has never heard of one, is a big limestone hill. But each of those limestone hills can have up to 12 species found nowhere else on the planet. Now, I can't have a panda for every one of my karsts, but I can use the panda to make people care about ecosystems and realize that that hill that they grew up next to may have species found nowhere else on the planet. And that if we turn that karst into limestone cement, then that species is gone, often without even having a scientific description. So there is no simple one answer. If there was, then there wouldn't be a problem. We can use pandas as an ambassador, but we need them to make people aware that there's a huge number of other species that are also important.
Yeah, and I think for every ecosystem there are species that have incredible stories.
Yeah.
And I think this is a way to engage people. So nature is full of, it's the best source of inspiration, the best source of innovation, beauty, and all the good things about life. There are so many stories in nature that are incredible and can capture the public's imagination in a way that it's hard just to talk about biodiversity. So For example, in Beijing, we tracked a migratory bird called the Beijing swift, and this is a bird that's people have lived around for generations. It's been in the city since the 1400s. Yeah, but until recently we never knew where it went for the winter, and through a tracking project we discovered that it flies all the way to South Africa for the northern winter and coming back to Beijing. And even more incredibly is that they almost certainly don't land during that time. So for 9 months of the year, they're in the air. They're eating in the air, drinking in the air, sleeping in the air. And so this is people think, wow, really? How can they possibly do that?
Kids would be so interested.
Yeah, suddenly people get excited about the Beijing swift and they want to save it. There are schools now in Beijing putting up nest boxes on their campuses to provide homes for swifts. That kids writing to building companies asking them to make their new buildings more friendly for swifts. And this has all been inspired by this incredible story. And so I think the storytelling about nature is incredibly powerful. And I think a lot of responsibility really for conservationists and biodiversity scientists is finding these stories and involving the public and telling these stories in a way that makes people feel some emotional connection with these species. And it could be a bird, it could be a panda, it could be anything. And
Every species has its stories.
yeah, and
Everybody likes a good story well told.
if I was a young scientist now, there'd be so many things I could be looking at. So there's so many opportunities to discover these stories and inspire people. And I think this is what we've got to get better at, is telling these stories.
We need more biodiversity scientists, more conservationists, more communicators, because scientists aren't always the best at telling their stories. They don't always have the right language, but we need to work in partnership, because people can only work on what they understand and what they know. And if the scientists aren't going to tell those stories, then someone else needs to, because unless the public cares about biodiversity, then there's not going to be a biodiversity. We have to have those kids getting excited about biodiversity, because it is exciting. And I mean, there are some studies that show scientists never grow up, because questioning is something we think children do. And a good scientist is always asking questions. So people need to be curious, because there is always more to learn.
The giant panda is probably the most recognizable umbrella species, whose conservation extends to numerous other species sharing its habitat. So what lessons can be drawn from panda conservation for other species?
The panda is one of very few species which population assessments show to actually be showing increases in the wild. It is one of very few success stories that we're actually aware of. So the panda is a fantastic way of starting the dialogue, but we need to now take the next step to make people realize just how many species there are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I see the giant panda as an ambassador for nature. It's a species, as Alice said, that's very well known. People can immediately feel a connection with, an affinity for, and love for. And I think, there was a very famous conservationist who said, in the end, everyone wants to protect what they love, but they can only love what they know. And so a panda is something that everyone knows and everyone can fall in love with, and everyone wants to protect. And I think by protecting the panda, you protect a whole ecosystem and all the species that are underneath. It's very difficult to get that kind of reaction with an insect. There are lots of species that are much harder to generate public affection for. And so the panda, I think, in that context is a wonderful ambassador for nature, to represent all of these other species that also need help and protection.
And one of the greatest barriers to people caring is a lack of understanding or a lack of information. I mean, a lot of my work is on bats. Most people, if you say bats, they're like, oh, I'm scared of bats. Actually, people just don't know about them. When people start that dialogue, they start understanding, they realize that most of these species either have no impact on us or they benefit us. In the case of bats, they provide important pollination services, they provide important pest control services. They're not going to hurt us. And if we don't think we like a species, then the best thing we can do is learn more.
So should we spend more money on panda conservation, or maybe redistribute some of the resources to other species like birds?
I would never say we're spending too much money on pandas or any other species. I think globally we're actually underspending significantly on biodiversity conservation. And so it's not the case of we need to spend less on panda. We need to spend more on everything else. We did a study last year in the Paulson Institute about how much we're currently spending globally on protecting nature and biodiversity, and how much we need to be spending over the next 10 years to protect our most important biodiversity and the services it provides. And we estimated that the gap between what we're spending now and what we need to spend is about $700 billion a year globally over the next 10 years. And that sounds like a lot of money, but actually it's less than 1% of global GDP, and it's less than the world spends in a year on soft drinks. We already heard earlier from the World Economic Forum that 50% of the global economy is dependent on nature or the services it provides. So that 1% of GDP investment looks very, very cheap to protect that 50% of the global economy. And of course, ultimately, all of our economy depends on having clean air, clean water, and a livable climate. So this is actually a really good investment for the global community.
Also, it's not just about the scientists making the efforts, but also the government, the public and private sectors, everyone.
It takes everyone, yeah.
I think we have to incorporate biodiversity into every aspect of
Our
life.
daily lives.
Yeah, and that's across government, business, communities, NGOs, everybody. We need to incorporate the interests of biodiversity across all of that activity.
If we don't, there will be long-term costs. It has to be, as Terry said, through everything we do, from the food we eat, from the clothes that we are wearing. Biodiversity needs to be a part of it. And if it's not, we're going to continue to fail to meet the global targets. And that's what we saw through the Aichi targets. We did not meet a single one of them. And one of the reasons was that none of them were actually integrated through communities.
What roles do you think new technologies can and should play in biodiversity conservation?
I think new technology can really help revolutionize biodiversity conservation. I think we've seen examples of that in recent years through things like infrared cameras. So, species that would be really difficult to monitor physically, through people having to go into the forest and find tracks, and it's incredibly time-consuming and labor intensive. Now with and sometimes dangerous. And so with infrared cameras, you're able to capture images and record videos of mammals that are very secretive, and because the cameras are, the animals ignore the cameras, they behave very naturally.
And also more scientific with all the data. So
Yeah, you get a lot more data.
Now you can get data the whole time because you can have these networks of camera traps out. Some of them will be using wireless networks. You don't even have to go and manually check them. That data is going to be beamed back to you, so you can analyze how species are using space over time, how it varies depending on things like moon phase, season. It provides us with so much information to manage these systems. And technology is fundamental for biodiversity. It's not just the camera traps, but we also have the tracking things that you've used for things like the Beijing swifts that we could never know otherwise. But also, we now have high-resolution remotely sensed data. So for things like deforestation, we can see it happening in almost real time. So that rather than relying on patrols to go and say, hey, someone's deforesting, let's do this, by which time it's far too late, the fact that we now have technology that allows us to monitor these systems in real time means we can intervene in real time. And if you have a migratory species and you don't know where it goes, well, you can protect its nesting area fantastically, but what if you're not protecting the areas it's feeding in during other parts of the year? So we can literally take the pulse of the planet and make sure that we are trying to keep it healthy.
And I think just a point on the migratory birds, how this technology is opening up our knowledge about the routes. And just as Alice mentioned, if you want to protect these birds, it's not just about protecting the breeding grounds, because these birds might breed in Arctic Russia, for example, but they might spend the winter in Australia. And then, of course, they stop along the way. So it's about protecting the breeding grounds, the wintering grounds, and the places that are important for stopover sites. So, and I think this is a really important message to show that migratory birds don't know geographic boundaries.
yeah,
So they don't stop at
we need to protect them beyond boundaries too.
have to work together if we're going to save a lot of these migratory species. So I think these birds are not owned by one country, they're shared. So it's a shared natural heritage, and with that shared heritage comes a shared responsibility to protect them. And so I think migratory birds is one part of biodiversity that really encourages countries to work together. And despite countries having differences on different political issues, this is an area where we have a shared interest. So it's really important that countries work together.
Yeah, I was thinking about Central Asia. There's a whole load of migratory antelopes in Central Asia, and the Commission on Migratory Species, which is another UN convention, has done a huge amount of work with countries to make them remove fences, because species could not access their migratory grounds because suddenly there was a fence there. And unless you have partnerships between countries, then those species are going to die out because they need to have their migratory routes.
I'd love to see biodiversity becoming more important in bilateral relationships between countries and regions also.
These species are going to move across the borders, and if we stop them, those species don't have a future.
Compared to pandas, bats, and birds, plants actually need more attention.
Everything needs attention. I mean, everything that we eat is either a plant or it fed on plants. Plants are fundamental to the basis of food chains, and we don't value them enough. I mean, look around us now. You have a rhododendron there, and rhododendrons are actually one of the centers of diversity is China. Yeah, right behind you, but you didn't notice it. We need to notice what's around us. We need to look what's around us and appreciate the diversity, because there is incredible diversity out there, and the plants are some of the most visible.
Yeah, and I think another point on plants is that a lot of our medicines come from plants. And
They're the producers of the system.
Yeah, and so they're incredibly valuable to us and have provided a great service to us over many years. And I think there's still a lot of species still to be discovered in some of the hotspots of biodiversity, and still a lot of research to be done on the potential of these plants to help us tackle major illnesses. So the more we lose biodiversity, the more we lose plant diversity, we're reducing the chances of us just making breakthrough discoveries related to medicine. So I think that's another one of the reasons why we should be caring about plant diversity as much as anything else.
As individuals, how can we do our part to help conserve biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think the answer is there are lots of things we can do. And I think different people will be inspired by different things. But I think Alice has talked a lot about consumer choices. So the choices we make as individuals in the products that we buy, the things we invest in. Even our pension funds, for example, we can now choose to say, right, we want a pension fund that invests in nature-friendly companies and not those that are doing harm. There's simple choices like that. Everyday food choices. Lots of things, cycling instead of getting in the car. There's a lot of lifestyle choices we can make every day.
It's actually us having the power.
Absolutely. I mean, I think often we don't realize we have that power. And so using that power, just simple little things like that. And also looking at, if you're a student, look at your campus. Say, right, what can we do here? Can we make the campus better for biodiversity? What wildlife do we have here? How can we help it and support it? If you work in a business, ask your employer, ask your business, what policy do you have on biodiversity? What are we doing as a company to support biodiversity? How are we aligning our operations with the objectives of the agreement that comes out of Kunming? So I think wherever you are, whatever you do, there are things you can do to help support biodiversity. The imagination is the only limit.
And people often feel disempowered. They think, oh, I'm just one person, what can I do? But the world is made up of just one people. If we all think we can't do anything, then nothing happens. But we're a social species. We respond to cues and to peers. If you start doing something better, then the people around you may start doing it too. And this is how we change the status quo. This is how we change the norm. So whether it be eating less meat or buying sustainably or deciding that rather than going on your expensive holiday, you're going to actually do some ecotourism, you're going to go to somewhere where that money goes towards supporting a local community. These are decisions we can all make. And if by making them and talking about them, they become the norm, that's how we affect change. But it all starts as an individual. And unless we as individuals change, then how do we expect the world to change around us?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.